I was heading back to Paradise Island because there was still one X on the map I hadn't touched. I was close to level 5, close enough to feel it sitting just out of reach, and I wanted to see what that second mark was hiding. The island had already surprised me once, and I wasn't done with it yet. This time, I turned the brass key in my hand and brought the cottage with me. While I was reviewing the cottage interface, a new line had appeared beneath its description. Cottage Upgrade, Safe House, unlocks at level 5. Once active, it would project a steady perimeter around itself, creating a true safe zone wherever I chose to deploy it. Bringing that kind of stability deeper into the dungeon felt less like a luxury and more like preparation. Before stepping into the teleport circle, I made one last stop at the goods and services tent. The black and white television flickered to life as soon as I entered, static clearing into crisp block text. If I was going back to Paradise Island with intention, I wanted my inventory light and my gold clean. I emptied the satchel onto the counter in measured stacks. Spare pixie pollen from the lower floor, extra silk wrappings, 2 polished river stones I'd held onto longer than necessary, and a bundle of minor salvage I had no practical use for. None of it justified carrying deeper into the dungeon. The television chimed softly as it appraised each item. Pixie pollen, 18 gold. Silk wrapping, 12 gold. River stones, 140 gold. Miscellaneous salvage, 63 gold. The total settled at plus 233 gold. My balance adjusted to 444 gold even. Not extravagant, not careless, just enough to move forward without hesitation. I left the food supplies alone. 2 wrapped steaks, trail bread, a spare tonic. Everything else could stay with me. When the transaction completed, the television dimmed back to idle, faint static whispering as I stepped outside. The giant tree stood steady at the center of the valley, the exit stair carved into its base, the teleport ruins glowing softly nearby. Paradise Island wasn't finished with me. I walked to the teleport circle and pressed my hand against the central glyph. Light traveled along the carved stone in a smooth pulse, and the valley dissolved into warm coastal brightness. The world steadied inside the cracked archway of the Paradise Island ruins. Ocean stretched wide beyond the cliffs, sunlight catching the water in long silver bands. The wind carried salt and warmth. The broken stone pillars leaned at the same angles I remembered, and the boat remained farther down the beach where I had left it. I still can't believe this is inside a dungeon, I said quietly. This time, I didn't move toward the shoreline. I stepped just beyond the teleport arch and placed the compact cottage device onto the sand instead. The brass key turned smoothly in my hand, and the structure unfolded outward in controlled mechanical motion. Walls rising, roof locking down, porch settling evenly into place. The cottage stood a few paces from the ruins, positioned for immediate access to teleportation if needed. From the porch, I had clear visibility across the beach and a direct line inland toward the dunes and scattered rock formations. A faint interface shimmered into view. Cottage deployed. Safe house. Unlocks at level 5. Not yet active. Soon. I walked once around the perimeter, testing placement and sightlines. The ruins remained directly behind the cottage. the shoreline to my right, the island interior stretching forward in quiet, open terrain. The second X waited somewhere beyond the dunes. The crab fields lay closer. I adjusted the satchel strap across my shoulder and stepped down from the porch. The cottage stood secure at my back, the teleport circle steady behind it. Paradise Island was quiet. That never meant empty. Had just stepped off the porch when the air shifted slightly around me, not with wind, but with intention. A soft chime rang out across the beach, bright and almost cheerful, and then the familiar voice followed. "Good morning, crawler. Congratulations on making it this far. We've decided this floor may have been a little too easy for you. A small adjustment has been made. We hope you enjoy the added challenge." The voice faded as gently as it had arrived, leaving only the sound of waves against the cliffs. I stood still for a moment, letting the words settle. "You're enjoying this," I muttered quietly, brushing sand from my gloves. It didn't feel threatening. If anything, it felt deliberate. The island hadn't changed visually. The shoreline remained calm, dunes steady in the light, the ruins silent behind me. But there was a subtle shift beneath it all, like the environment had tightened its focus. Search activated automatically as I moved inland. Buried movement registered to my left. The sand split open without warning, and a crab surged upward, larger than the last one I'd faced here. Its shell carried darker ridges, reinforced along the spine, and one claw snapped forward with sharper precision. I didn't retreat. Instead, I drew the hood of quiet shadows over my head and let invisibility settle into place. The world softened immediately, edges smoothing, sound narrowing to a clean center. The crab turned once, confused, claws clicking against sand. I stepped behind it with measured calm and drove the dagger downward along the seam beneath its shell. The strike was controlled, precise, and the second followed cleanly before the creature could pivot. The crab stilled quickly, legs folding inward as it collapsed into the sand. Pale gold text shimmered briefly above the sand. Crab defeated, experience gained. The warmth that followed spread evenly through my chest and down into my arms, steady and controlled rather than explosive. A soft pulse traveled across my interface, and the level indicator shifted upward with quiet confirmation. Level 5 achieved. I exhaled slowly, letting the balance settle into place. The shift felt stabilizing rather than dramatic, as though the edges of my movements had been refined instead of amplified. Almost immediately, another notification followed, brighter than the last. Cottage Upgrade. Safe house unlocked. The cottage interface expanded briefly in my vision, displaying the newly activated feature. Once deployed, it would now project a stable perimeter around itself, establishing a true safe zone for as long as the structure remained in place. No countdown, no fragile shield, a fixed pocket of calm within the dungeon's ecosystem. "That's useful," I said quietly, brushing sand from my gloves as I crouched again beside the fallen crab. The timing felt deliberate. The dungeon had adjusted the challenge, and in return, it had handed me something sturdier to stand on. As I reached to lift the crab, I noticed the sand beneath it had compacted around something solid. A narrow wooden edge pressed faintly against the surface, almost hidden by the creature's weight. I cleared the sand carefully and revealed a small chest reinforced with thin brass bands, its latch closed but not locked. I opened it slowly. Inside rested a compact metal sphere, matte green with a capped nozzle at its top. The label was stamped cleanly into the casing in block lettering. Weed killer, plant-specific gas device, effective against hostile flora, limited dispersal radius, non-destructive to fauna and stone. I turned the device once in my hand, considering the specificity. Not an explosive, not a general weapon, something designed with intention. Hostile flora, I murmured. The grenade disappeared into the satchel as I stood, the weight barely noticeable among the rest of my supplies. Behind me, the cottage remained deployed beside the teleport ruins, and now, with Safe House active, a steady perimeter extended outward from its frame, subtle but firm. Paradise Island felt the same as before, but the dungeon's announcement lingered in my thoughts. A greater challenge, a small adjustment. I looked inland toward the dunes and scattered stone beyond them. If the dungeon had raised the difficulty, then whatever waited at the second X was likely no longer incidental. After the warmth of level 5 settled evenly through my frame, I returned to the cottage instead of pressing farther inland. The second X could wait a few minutes. If the dungeon had upgraded the structure, I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I stepped onto the porch and opened the cottage interface fully. A new entry pulsed gently at the top of the upgrade list. Unlock now available. Safe House. I selected it, and the description expanded across the screen. Safe House establishes a stable proximity zone, measuring approximately 1/2 acre around the deployed cottage. Hostile entities will not enter the boundary. New spawns suppressed within perimeter. The wording was direct and almost understated, but the scale of it was not. 1/2 acre was more than a circle in the sand. It was territory. I pressed unlock. The cottage responded immediately. A warm amber light traveled outward from the frame of the house, beginning at the foundation and rising through the walls, across the roofline, and along the porch railing. The glow intensified for a breath, then expanded outward in a smooth wave across the sand. The ground itself reacted. The sparse brush and wild growth nearest the cottage folded inward and dissolved into clean soil. Stray rocks shifted aside, settling into neater edges. The open sand beyond the porch smoothed into a defined yard, and along the outer edge of the glowing boundary, a small white picket fence rose gradually from the ground, post by post, until it enclosed the entire 1/2 acre perimeter. The amber light dimmed slowly, leaving the cottage centered within a clearly defined yard bordered by the new fence. The teleport ruins now sat comfortably inside the perimeter, and the shoreline just beyond the fence line remained untouched. I stood still, taking in the transformation. "Well," I said softly, almost to myself, "that's substantial." The yard felt intentional, not decorative, not exaggerated, just stable. A proper anchor point carved into the dungeon's ecosystem. I reopened the cottage interface and scrolled further down the upgrade list. Beneath Safe House, a new category had brightened. Upgrades available. Only one entry was illuminated clearly: Constant Gardener. I selected it and read carefully. Constant Gardener enables cultivated garden growth within the safe house perimeter. Crops continue to grow while cottage is stored. Requirement: 5 crab shells. I checked the inventory automatically. Crab shells 3. Too short. The interface dimmed the unlock button, leaving it inactive but visible. The path forward was clear enough. I closed the interface and stepped off the porch, the new fence standing quietly around the property. I stayed on the porch a moment longer, taking in the fence line and the steady openness of the yard. The half-acre perimeter didn't feel artificial or forced into place. It felt earned, carved cleanly into the dungeon's logic. For the first time since entering this world, I had something that resembled territory instead of shelter. The morning light was still soft over the water, and the island felt fresh rather than tense. With the safe house upgrade active and the second egg still waiting inland, I found myself grinning instead of rushing. If I needed 2 more crab shells to unlock Constant Gardener, then that was an easy excuse to move along the shoreline before heading deeper. 2 more, I said quietly, stepping down from the porch and crossing through the new gate in the fence. The pickets closed behind me without resistance, the boundary remaining steady as I moved beyond it. The teleport ruins and the cottage stood secure at my back, and that stability made the open beach feel less uncertain. I let search settle into place as I walked parallel to the shoreline, scanning for disturbances in the sand. The island responded clearly this time: buried movement patterns, denser pockets of compacted sand, subtle ridges that suggested tunneling beneath the surface. The crabs here didn't wander far from their nests, and once I understood the pattern, they were easier to anticipate. The first one erupted from the sand with a sharp spray of grit, larger than the smaller shoreline variants, but not as reinforced as the darker specimen from earlier. I sidestepped its initial lunge, let it overextend, and drove the dagger cleanly into the seam beneath its shell. The movement was controlled and economical, more practice than struggle, and the creature stilled quickly. Crab defeated, crab shell acquired. The second followed a few minutes later, near a cluster of smooth stones closer to the waterline. This one attempted to circle instead of charge, its claws scraping against damp sand. But invisibility settled around me long enough to reposition and finish the encounter cleanly. When it collapsed, I gathered the shell and added it to the growing stack in my inventory. Crab shell acquired. Total 5. I paused there, listening to the steady rhythm of waves against the shore. The ocean felt calm, but something about the beach seemed slightly rearranged from my last visit, as if the dungeon's earlier adjustment had shifted more than difficulty alone. Before turning inland toward the second X, I angled farther down the shoreline. The boat should still be there. It had been half pulled onto the sand near the rocky outcropping, angled safely above the tide line. I wanted to confirm it hadn't drifted, splintered, or been claimed by whatever change the dungeon had introduced. If I needed to move quickly between islands again, I preferred knowing it was reliable. I walked along the water's edge until the familiar silhouette came into view. The boat remained where I had left it, hull steady, paddles resting inside. With 5 crab shells now secured in my inventory, I didn't head inland toward the second X just yet. The safe house perimeter felt new enough to deserve attention, and unlocking Constant Gardener suddenly seemed more interesting than chasing whatever the dungeon had adjusted beyond the dunes. I turned back toward the cottage, the boat confirmed behind me, the shoreline quiet and undisturbed. Inside the fence line, the yard felt intentionally open, as if waiting to be shaped. I opened the cottage interface again and selected Constant Gardener, the requirement now satisfied. The unlock confirmation pulsed once across the screen before I pressed it without hesitation. The change began immediately. A warm green light spread outward from the base of the cottage, different from the amber tone of Safe House. The soil within the perimeter shifted, leveling itself more deliberately, and rectangular forms began to rise from the ground in smooth, structured rows. Raised wooden garden beds settled into place across the yard, evenly spaced with dark, rich soil filling each one. Along the inner edge of the picket fence, circular plots opened at measured intervals, bordered by low stone rings. The earth within them deepened in color, clearly intended for trees rather than crops. A narrow stone path unfurled from the porch steps towards the wooden gate, curving gently between the garden rows before settling into place. The light faded, leaving the yard transformed. "Well," I said softly, stepping off the porch and onto the new stone path. That escalated quickly. I approached the nearest raised bed and opened its interface. A clean selection menu appeared above the soil, offering a list of cultivars categorized by type and growth time. Root vegetables, leafy greens, climbing vines, medicinal herbs, and flowering plants scrolled neatly in organized rows. I selected a mix deliberately: carrots for steady yield, potatoes for reliability, lavender and mint for crafting potential. A small row of nightshade herbs labeled cautionary, but clearly useful for advanced recipes. The soil shimmered faintly with each confirmation, seeds embedding themselves invisibly into the earth. I moved to the next bed and chose climbing beans and low-growing berries. Another received wheat and barley. Another, a patchwork of cabbage and onions. I didn't rush the choices. The morning felt open, and the act of selecting what would grow here felt like setting long-term intention rather than completing a task. When I reached the circular tree plots along the fence, the interface shifted categories. Tree selections available: banana tree, fast growth, tropical yield; orange tree, moderate growth, balanced harvest; apple tree, slower growth, high storage value; pear tree, durable, consistent fruit; coconut palm, requires coastal proximity. I smiled at that last option and selected coconut palms for the plots closest to the shoreline side of the fence. Apple and pear trees took the central rings, while bananas and oranges filled the remaining spaces. With each confirmation, small saplings emerged from the soil, no taller than my knee, but already rooted firmly. The yard felt alive without being crowded. I walked the stone path once more, scanning the beds and trees in quiet satisfaction. The garden didn't feel ornamental. It felt functional, renewable, a system layered into the dungeon structure that would continue working whether I stood here or moved deeper. After finishing the final selection, I returned to the porch and opened the cottage interface again, curious what other expansions had revealed themselves. A new category had appeared beneath garden. Upgrades available. Craft bench. Requires level 6 and 10 hardwood planks. Larger porch. Requires 15 hardwood planks. Fish pond. Requires level 6, 10 seashells, and 5 fish, alive. I studied the list carefully, noting how the requirements had shifted toward longer-term resource gathering rather than quick materials from the island's surface. Hardwood planks meant deliberate harvesting or deeper dungeon zones. Seashells and live fish meant preparation and transport. Level 6 sat just out of reach, quietly gating the more advanced options. "That's fair," I murmured, resting one hand along the porch railing. The cottage wasn't meant to be completed in a single morning. It was meant to grow with me. The fish pond lingered in my thoughts for a moment longer than the others. A contained water source inside the safe house perimeter would mean renewable fish without leaving the fence. But that would have to wait until I crossed into level 6. I closed the interface, the garden beds and saplings stretching quietly across the yard behind me. 15 hardwood planks for expanded space and rocking chairs didn't sound extravagant, and the thought of sitting beneath the overhang while the garden grew quietly around me felt surprisingly appealing. The second X on the map would still be waiting when I returned, but comfort felt like a worthwhile detour. I checked my satchel and found the iron axe resting near the bottom of the inventory list. I hadn't used it before, but the balance felt right in my hands as I stepped beyond the fence and approached one of the sturdier hardwood trees lining the outer edge of the island. The first swing landed solidly, and pale gold text shimmered briefly into view. New skill acquired. Woodcutting, level 1. Each level increases efficiency per swing. I adjusted my stance and continued, settling into a steady rhythm. The resistance of the trunk became easier to read with each strike, the axe biting deeper as my movements grew more precise. What began as careful effort gradually turned into smooth repetition, the blade cutting cleaner and faster with every tree. By the time the final trunk tipped and settled into the sand, the notification appeared again. Woodcutting, level 10. I lowered the axe and exhaled, surprised at how naturally the progression had unfolded. What felt like steady practice rather than strain had turned the task into something almost methodical, and the line of fallen hardwood trees around me reflected the difference. I approached the nearest trunk and opened its interaction menu. Store whole tree, store as firewood, store as planks. Planks, I said softly. The trunk dissolved into neatly processed boards that transferred directly into the satchel. I moved from tree to tree, converting each one the same way, the stack of hardwood planks rising quickly with each confirmation. When I finished, I opened the inventory and counted. Hardwood planks. Tries Desmit. More than enough. I glanced back toward the cottage, already imagining the extended porch and the slow sway of rocking chairs facing the garden beds. Comfort was officially within budget. By the time I finished converting the last trunk into planks and secured the axe back into my inventory, the morning had shifted more than I realized. My focus had been on the rhythm of each swing, on the steady climb of a new skill, and on the satisfying total of hardwood boards stacking neatly in my satchel. It wasn't until I turned back toward the cottage that I noticed something had changed. The yard beyond the fence no longer looked newly planted. Where small saplings had stood knee-high earlier, full-grown trees now rose confidently along the inner perimeter. Apple branches arched outward, heavy with red fruit. Orange trees glowed softly against their green leaves, and the coconut palms nearer the shoreline leaned gently above the picket fence, already crowned with clustered shells. The raised garden beds had transformed as well. Carrots and potatoes filled their rows with thick green tops. Lavender bloomed in soft purple clusters, and berry vines threaded themselves along the edges of the boxes in dense, productive tangles. The soil no longer looked recently turned. It looked cultivated. I stepped through the gate slowly, taking in the quiet abundance. Constant Gardener. The name had felt practical when I unlocked it, but this felt immediate. The garden hadn't required days or waiting. It had simply grown, maturing into full yield within the safe house perimeter while I worked beyond it. "Well," I murmured, brushing my hand lightly across the leaves of the nearest apple tree. "That's efficient." I reached up and twisted one apple free from its branch. The fruit was cool and firm in my palm, weighty in a way that suggested real substance rather than decorative design. I took a bite. The taste was crisp and clean, sweet without being sharp, and the faintest notification shimmered briefly at the edge of my vision. Minor stamina recovery. I finished the apple slowly as I walked back toward the porch, the stone path steady beneath my boots. The yard felt complete now, not temporary. A garden that would continue growing even when the cottage was stored meant stability. I hadn't expected to build this quickly. I opened the cottage interface once more and selected larger porch, the requirement highlighted in green, the hardwood planks ready for use. Hardwood planks. Trisdesmit. Required. 15. I confirmed the upgrade. Amber light spread outward from the base of the porch in a smooth wave, similar to the safe house activation, but more localized. The railing extended outward first, doubling the depth of the porch with solid wooden beams anchoring into the foundation. Additional supports rose from the ground, and the roofline adjusted subtly to match the expansion. When the glow settled, two sturdy rocking chairs rested side by side near the front edge of the porch, angled toward the garden rather than the shoreline. Their wood matched the tone of the cottage exactly, smooth and polished, built for quiet mornings rather than display. I stepped onto the expanded porch and ran a hand along the arm of one chair before lowering myself into it. The wood creaked softly beneath my weight, then settled into a slow, steady rhythm as I pushed back gently with one foot. The garden stretched before me in quiet fullness, fruit hanging from branches, vegetables ready for harvest, the fence defining the boundary without feeling restrictive. Beyond it, Paradise Island remained open and waiting, the second X still unvisited somewhere inland. I let the rocking chair move gently beneath me, the motion steady and unforced, the porch roof shading the warmth of the late morning sun. The air carried a soft blend of salt from the shoreline and the faint sweetness of fruit ripening along the fence. As the chair settled into its rhythm, a new shimmer of pale gold appeared at the edge of my vision. Resting comfort, active, rapid health, regeneration enabled, stamina restored while seated. The notification lingered for a moment before fading, and almost immediately I felt the difference. The small tension that had gathered in my shoulders from swinging the axe eased without effort, and the subtle weight of movement in my legs softened into something lighter. The chair wasn't just decorative, it was restorative. "That's nice," I said quietly, leaning back further and letting one foot guide the slow arc of motion. From this angle, the yard felt complete in a way I hadn't expected so early into the dungeon's progression. The apple trees formed a gentle curve along the fence line, their leaves shifting faintly in the breeze. The garden beds sat in orderly rows, full and alive without feeling crowded, each one promising future meals, crafting ingredients, or small comforts I hadn't thought to plan for yet. The stone path leading from the gate to the porch felt intentional now, not just functional. It connected the boundary to the house in a way that made the space feel lived in rather than temporary. Even the picket fence, simple and clean, framed the view without closing it off. I watched the light move slowly across the tops of the raised beds and felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, settled deeper than the regeneration effect itself. The cottage was no longer just a place to recover. It had become something steadier, a pocket of warmth carved into the dungeon's depth. The chair moved in a slow, easy rhythm as I glanced toward the cottage door and remembered the crab stored neatly in my satchel. Fresh garden vegetables, ripe fruit, and a shoreline full of salt air felt like the right setting for something simple and satisfying. I stood from the chair with an unhurried stretch and smiled to myself. I think I'll eat some crab,